You are listening to the ERP, Organizational Change Journal, a podcast brought to you by Nestell Associates.
Paul, I do want to ask you, you mentioned a couple of times, so far in our conversation today, leadership. So I do want to ask you something. In fact, I have a leadership article that we're going to post here in the next couple of days, and I talk about this exact idea. But on your site, again, you'd mentioned that for leadership, most models of leadership and change were developed in the previous century, and most leadership education is rooted in ideas of leadership that were birthed when organizations were different, end quote. So my question for you, you see this, talk about evidence-based approach and evidence-based research and, applied research. These ideas kind of change over time because our context and our world changes. But what would you say are the pitfalls of using 20th century leadership notions in the 21st century organizations? Just in general, any thoughts to that question? I know it's a pretty wide open question, but what would be your initial response to that?
Where did our ideas of big organizations come from? If you go way back to the beginning of the 20th century, and organizations began to scale in the Industrial Revolution and into the 20th century with great American companies such as Ford Motor Company and stuff like that. How do we run a big company? And the answers we found came from the only two big organizations that existed on the planet previously, where we would have hundreds of thousands of people, and we had to organize them to produce value together. And that was the church and the military. There's where we learned. And those have a particular there's a particular hierarchy, rigid hierarchy in the military and the church, particularly the Catholic Church. But, those were how we learned when we began to think about how to run big organizations, the leadership templates that we inherited. Highly structured, highly hierarchical, highly formal, rigid structures, boxes on an org chart. And that's the way that, we learned to run big companies, of course. And of course, it produced a lot of value. We created these huge bureaucratic enterprises. I work for one, IBM. And the question is, when we came into our century, we began to rethink two things. We began to rethink command and control, because people today, workers have a lot of liberty, particularly in a tight talent market as we have today. They can vote with their feet. And so command and control, which reduces the workers' autonomy and engagement, is a really sort of dangerous turf. But yet we've inherited these notions and they die very slowly. So that's one thing, is the sort of end of the command and control. The other thing is these kind of rigid boxes and structures. And we've begun to think about ways about making organizations more agile and more responsive. So in a very static external environment, if you have a static organizational structure, you'll be fine. But in an organization which is changing quickly, you need to be able to pivot. And you can't pivot if your hierarchies are super rigid. So those two things are features that, we hear the word agility used to death today. Is how do you create agile organizations, not just agile projects? I think the agile methodology has a lot to teach us about how to run projects, but how do you create agile organizations? And that was the question I began to ask in the Science of Organizational Change. Golly, now it's 10 years ago, is how do we create agile organizations? Because a lot of what we do in change management is we are trying to put out change fires where things are going badly, and where what we're bumping up against is these formal structures that get in the way of change. And so a lot of what I had to do in my early change work was help, in a sense, put out change fires where things had gone really, really badly for the organization. People were just, leaving. There was one organization, it was a finance function reorganization I was worked in. They had 30% attrition. All the people with good resumes were leaving because they were so pissed off with the change. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so I was called in to put out a lot of change fires. As I said, change is often brought in too little, too late. And I was often brought in like halfway through when, if you'll forgive the vulgarity, the shit had hit the fan. And they said, we want this change expert to come in and sprinkle some change pixie dust to make everybody feel better. And I'll be frank with you, sometimes it was too late. Like once people are gone, they're gone, is one thing. And once you've damaged trust and engagement, it's very hard to recover lost trust. And so these were the things that doing, is I thought if we had organizations more agile, more responsive, we'd have fewer of these change fires to put out.